Hi, everybody. I'm honored the Brooklyn Book Festival has asked me to moderate this panel with these amazing authors. Essayist Eula Biss of Having and Being Had, cultural historian Imani Perry, author of Breathe, Letter to My Sons, and economist Stephanie Kelton. His book is The Deficit Myth. As you know, there's a little green button at the bottom of the screen, so you can go and buy these amazing books. I encourage you to get them all if you can. Our topic is waking up from the American dream. I think we win for the most depressingly timely panel at the festival. And it could be very scary and very depressing, but we are going to try to make it as fun as possible. The way this is going to work is that each of us will spend a couple of minutes telling you about our books. Then we will have a conversation about money and lack of money. And we'd love to hear from all of you in the audience. So please start typing questions now into the chat. I'm monitoring them on this, my other computer, and I will try to ask every single one of them if we can find the time in this 45 minutes. All the books are very different. I think every one of the panelists here mentioned to me that they felt like an outlier on the panel. I think that is the name of the game here. We are all outliers from this theme, but I think it'll be more interesting that way. So we're all going to introduce ourselves. I'll start. My book is called Why We Can't Sleep, Women's New Midlife Crisis. So it's about Generation X women primarily, so women born between 1965 and 1980. I did a little Googling, and according to Wikipedia, every author on this panel is a Generation X woman, which means it will be the best panel. So I argue that our generation was told we can have it all. We can do it all, we can be anything, even president, and then come to find out when we hit middle age that it is very hard not only to have it all, but to have even some of it. A lot of us wound up with job insecurity, a lot of debt, and financial panic, quite frankly. And this was before the coronavirus hit. According to the Equality of Opportunity Project at Harvard, Gen Xers' parents had a 90% chance of doing better financially than our parents. For women born in the 1980s, only 25% will out-earn their fathers. A lot of women internalize this failure and blame themselves, when really there have been a lot of forces at work against us. So in my book, I argue that we were sold a bill of goods, and that for all that talk of you can be anything, in fact, many of us were set up to fail. I interviewed about 200 women around the country, and a lot of them told me that when they were told you can do anything, you can be anything, that what they heard is they had to do all the things and they had to do them all beautifully. And that if they weren't able to, they thought, what's wrong with me? Why does everybody else have it figured out? So I say that that space between expectation and achievement has made a lot of people very stressed out, full of shame and sad. And I argue that looking really hard at the situation, the realities around us can be very liberating and freeing. A lot of women have emailed me since they read the book and said it made them feel less alone. So that is my book, Why We Can't Sleep. I would like to now turn it over to Eula Biss, who's going to talk about having and being had. Eula, ready?
Thanks so much, Ada. I really appreciate it. And I'm totally excited to be in conversation with all these other outliers. I love knowing that we all think we're outliers here. So my new book, Having and Being Had, is about the everyday lived experience within our economic system and everyday resistance to the stories we tell ourselves about money. And I like what you said, Ada, about the power of looking hard at the situation. Looking hard is really part of the project of this book. It's written in a series of short titled works, and each work is devoted to a moment in time, an exchange between people, a conversation, a work of art, a game, a book. There's a work about buying IKEA furniture. There's a work about playing Monopoly. There's a work about choosing a color of white paint. There's a work about a Beyonce music video. There's a work about washing a comforter in a laundromat. And all of these works talk to each other and add up to a meditation on ownership, class, and capitalism. And I guess I should add power. I think power is threaded through the entire meditation. So I'm going to read a work titled Pokemon from this book. It's kind of in the beginning third. And this work is about watching children invent an economy that seems to eerily mirror certain aspects of the economy at large. Pokemon. Jay has 2 Pokemon cards that he was given on the first day of first grade by a boy who told him they were, quote, starter cards. He doesn't know anything about Pokemon, but soon he wants more cards. At the comic book shop, we discover that a pack of these cards costs $3, which means Jay can buy them with the money I give him for doing chores. But what the cards cost has nothing to do with what they're worth. The value of any given card is determined by a group of children gathered on the asphalt of the school playground. There is, in the world beyond the playground, an established market for these cards and websites that chart their rising and falling prices like stocks. But these kids don't really know about that yet. They're still inventing their own values. On the asphalt, some cards are coveted because they're shiny, others because nobody has them yet, and others because they're powerful. How powerful a card might be is divined from the numbers printed on the card, which are manipulated with flawed first grade math that leads to debate over the exact quantity of power in play. There's debate too about what constitutes a good trade. After Jay trades away his most powerful card for a less powerful card, I hear the babysitter asking him if he was a smart negotiator. She suggests that he might want to try to get more for a card like that next time. Then he comes home with the entire collection of another boy, 2 years younger, who's traded it all to him for one card. A game can be played with these cards, supposedly, but none of the kids understand the rules. Their end is accumulation, collecting cards for a game they don't know how to play. I'll turn it back to you.
That's lovely. And my son was very into Pokemon, and I asked another parent how, I can't win. I can't figure it out. Like I was trying to play, and it just always seemed like, oh, you lose. And he was like, you're never going to win with that attitude.
We can probably
It is a
apply
trap.
that to our panel too.
Exactly. So thanks so much, Eula. And of course, I neglected to read your bio, and I should say it, you're the author of 4 books, most recently Having and Being Had and On Immunity, which is so beautiful, as well as this one was named one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the New York Times Book Review, and Notes from No Man's Land won the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2009. So thank you again for that Pokemon reading. And now I'd like us to hear from Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie Kelton is a leading authority on modern monetary theory, a new approach to economics. She is considered one of the most important voices influencing the policy debate today. She teaches economic and public policy at Stony Brook University, and she was recently named to the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force on the Economy. So Stephanie, I'd love you to read and or talk for a couple of minutes so we can get to know your book.
Sure. Well, Ada, it's funny because you started off talking about how we've been told all of our lives, we can have it all, we can have anything. And my book is sort of, coming at this from the perspective of our nation as a whole, that really what we've been told almost my entire adult lifetime, if not my whole life, is that we're actually being given too much. That we are already trying to have more than we, in a sense, should have, more than we deserve. And in other words, as a country, that we've been living beyond our means, right? And so my book is looking at the economic question, and the title of the book is The Deficit Myth. And so what I'm really trying to do is to chip away at so many of, I will argue, the wrong-headed misconceptions, myths that have really held us back as a nation, not just here in the US, but countries around the world that have, for a variety of reasons, adopted policies that have kept the nation poorer, right? Materially poorer, without the niceties, the benefits, the things that we could have had that are well within our reach, but we don't produce them. We don't produce the kind of economy that would make people materially better off, improve lives for people, provide better safeguards and protections, better care for people, because we're afraid of this thing called the deficit, because we're afraid of this thing called the national debt. And so we've been told that our country has been spending too much money, right? It's that we already have too much. We're spending too much. We're running up these deficits. We're piling on debt. We're burdening the next generation. That what we really ought to be doing is figuring out how to do with less, right? How to reduce the amount that we spend, how to live within our means. In other words, it's an austerity framework that we're being asked to embrace for the sake of reducing arbitrary numbers on government balance sheets, which have no feelings, which never go hungry, right? The deficit and the debt are fine. This is what I argue in the book. But there are so many real deficits in our economy that we aren't dealing with. Deficits in healthcare, deficits in education, deficits in our infrastructure, a climate deficit. And so we're really neglecting the deficits that matter out of fear and misunderstandings, misplaced concerns about arbitrary numbers on balance sheets. So a lot of the book is really knocking down, the first 6 chapters are about knocking down the biggest myths that we're told, and then opening up space for a different kind of conversation to really change the questions so that we're no longer asking, how will we pay for it? We instead begin to ask, how will we resource it? How will our country come up with the nurses and the doctors and the teachers and the faculty that we need to provide education for everyone, to provide healthcare for everyone? Like, what kind of a world could we have if we changed the question? And so that's really what the book attempts to do.
That's lovely. And yeah, and I think asking different questions is a kind of a theme of a lot of the books on the panel today, and that's great. Okay, so now we'd like to turn to Imani Perry. Imani Perry is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and a faculty associate with the programs in Law and Public Affairs, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Jazz Studies. She's the author of 6 books, including Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry. In a star review, Kirkus Reviews wrote that her new book, Breathe, is, quote, a masterfully poetic and intimate work that anchors mothering within the long-standing tradition of Black resistance and resourcefulness. She has a lot of books that are very relevant to this talk today. I hope she talks about several of them. So I'd like to turn it over to her for a couple minutes.
Thank you. So I'll just say that Breathe, really quickly, is a kind of a 3-part epistolary to my sons. It's the first book that I've written that could be properly categorized as creative nonfiction. And I've written quite a bit about inequality and patriarchy and neoliberal capitalism and various other texts. And there's a way in which this book, in some sense, kind of synthesizes those questions in an intimate form. So I'm going to read a little bit, and I think that will maybe give a useful entry point into the work. We cried for Trayvon. You heard every bit of how a child was made a demon and hunted, a child like you. You wore hoodies as resistance, like a million more, innocent and beautiful, a target, but more importantly, an unapologetic human being. It was moving, and then it was heartbreaking. I told you not to raise your hands up in the don't shoot position that was common then. I told you to raise your right fists how I was taught, power. The massacre happens in police violence, in hoods flooded with guns, in survivalists and anti-socialists for whom murder gives purpose. This nation that is yours by inheritance and birth is in a state of panic and disaster. Its imperial grandeur is ending. Upward mobility is waning. Precariousness is multiplying. And yet the rich keep getting richer. Whiteness is ebbing. And those who are afraid are turning to a game of cowboys and gangsters going out with a viral blaze of glory. This is before the pandemic, but children keep dying. The world keeps turning them bitter and demonic indeed. My children, you have seen us, the adults in your world, impotent to bring our lost ones back, to protect the children or the mothers or the fathers, or to even avenge their deaths, as useless as retribution would be when it comes to broken hearts. We have completely failed at making those who act with violent impunity stop what they're doing. In fact, a call to the police is an audaciously wielded weapon of white discontent these days. With each sin, the violent, hateful ones grow bolder. They know they can take our lives without consequence, and if not that, stage theaters of our humiliation. And yet, your power sustains. My father had the poem, Who Killed McDuffie, above his desk while I was growing up. It is a harrowing account of the unsolved murder of a Black man in Miami in 1979. I learned practically from birth that judicial procedure was a cruel choreography and not a fact-finding when it came to violence against Black people. That is the terror that makes me want to say, that could have been my child, and also that could have been me, even though thoughts of the self cannot, should not take over our collective outrage and grief. And I know that despite my fear, I cannot clip your wings, as though cowering is a respectful tribute to the beauty we have lost. No, I want your wings span wide, to honor the departed, ancestral, and immediate be. Living defined by terror is itself destructive of the spirit, and it is submission. The truth is that life is unsafe, and genius more often than not remains unvalidated or even worse, dormant. But joy, even in slivers, shows up everywhere. Take it and keep taking it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And several people in the comments were just writing now about how moving that was. The comments are lighting up for everyone. So we'll have plenty of questions, I think. I'd like to encourage people to keep adding questions. I'm going to ask a couple of my own, but then by 5:30, I'd love to just turn it over to the masses. So I'd like to start by just talking about the economy. A recent New York Times article painted a dire picture that was said, collectively, state governments will have budget shortfalls of $312 billion through the summer of 2022. When local governments are factored in, the shortfall rises to $500 billion. That estimate assumes the pandemic doesn't get worse. Stephanie, can you maybe start off by putting this into a little perspective for us?
Yeah, sure. So the first chapter of my book is called Don't Think of a Household. And this is where I try to make clear to the reader why the federal government and only the federal government is in a position to provide, I'll say, the fiscal support, to support the economy through the economic downturn for as long as it takes. So you're talking about state and local governments, which, probably everybody has heard, whether it's Governor Newsom in California, Governor Cuomo in New York, everybody in between, mayors and governors. There has been an outpouring of, pleas with the federal government from state and local officials. Please provide help. We need help, right? We're hemorrhaging revenue and we can't sustain essential services. We can't pay teachers. We can't keep the state running without the federal government's help. So why? What is it about the federal government? I mean, if the bottom is falling out of the economy, why is the federal government in any better position to spend money than any state or local government or any business or any worker in the economy? And the answer is the federal government is different because the federal government is the issuer of our currency. It's the issuer of the dollar. And because it's the issuer of the currency, it can never run out. You see, that's the thing about money, is that at the federal level, the government is, in a sense, not financially constrained, whereas state and local governments very much are financially constrained. So, I think one of the things that we're likely to see, maybe even in a matter of hours, is that the Congress is going to get together and do another big relief bill. And we're looking probably at another close to $2 trillion maybe. that the federal government can step up and provide support. And I think that there's going to be support for state and local governments, thank God, in that, because that's going to help them plug holes and hold on to teachers and firefighters and provide essential services. So it's vital that the federal government comes through with some money for state and local governments, because once those layoffs begin, and by the way, they've already laid off more than 1 million workers across the country, state and local governments. As those layoffs begin, you take somebody's job away, you take away their income, you take away their ability to spend and support other jobs in the economy. So this is really important. I think we're going to hopefully see some movement in a positive direction here in the next day or so.
That's good and reassuring. Thank you very much. So Imani, I'd like to turn it to you. So I know for this part of the discussion, it might make more sense for you to talk a bit about your 2018 book, Vexy Thing, on gender and liberation. For those who haven't read it, it's a work of gender theory grounded in political economy and this history of patriarchy at the crossroads of property, legal personhood, and sovereignty. So I'm wondering if you want to talk about the state of America, the American economy right now, and who can prosper and who can't.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that we're experiencing the sort of consequences of is, at this point, since the late 1970s, a progressive evacuation of the social safety net, the marketization of everything, the creation of the gig economy, growing precarity in every sector, and this sense that competitive frameworks or markets are actually the solution to all social problems, and the consequence of that is that we have less protection. And at the same time, we're inheriting these kind of older forms of bigotry, older structures of inequality as we're confronting new forms of vulnerability. And then on top of it, there's the hypermedia age, right, which sells us a conception of civic participation that is largely happening on corporate platforms, and also a way in which we see our political representation coming in the form of images as opposed to interests often. And so, one of the examples might be that, talking about the first this or first that, or this sort of public figure who's supposed to represent you, even as one doesn't see significant shifts in inequality. And so one of the things I try to point to in that work, and that's a kind of, quick and dirty description of the problematic, but is the importance of being honest about both the ways in which we continue to live with the histories of patriarchy, with the histories of white supremacy, with the history of capitalism and exploitation and the like, and also confront some new challenges, and to try to develop values accordingly. I think to be a little bit optimistic, because it's very easy to be pessimistic in every way, I do think one of the things that's been, for me, has been really wonderful to witness in the wake of the pandemic in particular, but also the social movements associated with Black Lives Matter and this earlier this year in particular, which reached a kind of an intensity and a public engagement that really was unprecedented in recent history, is that mutual aid seems to be growing as a kind of deliberate political commitment. I think that's really quite important. And also renewal of political education that happens in a collective manner. And it's part of why I think all of these books are meaningful, because people are actually engaged, not just, reading. People, there was all this prediction of the death of the book, but, people are reading, but also engaging with each other, doing what was once called consciousness raising, right? Activities in which collectives of people are working together to think through, how ought our society be organized. And so that's the kind of silver lining, I think, of this moment.
That's lovely. And finally, Eula, so your book, in its outlier status, is not really argument driven. It's a series of open-ended meditations. And in the spirit of poetry, it's as much about its own creation as it is about its content. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how the book deals with these ideas of having and not having. I really loved what you were saying about feeling this sort of class change in becoming a homeowner and all the new things you learned when you owned your own home.
Yeah, one of the things I was really interested in looking at as I was writing this, and writing it from my perspective, from my lived experience as a white upper middle class woman. I was interested in how the middle class convinces itself that it's experiencing scarcity when it's actually experiencing plenty, and that's not always the case. And even what we mean by middle class is so huge and baggy. I discovered this when I was researching for this book, that it's nobody has the same definition of the middle class, not sociologists or economists or the government. The census defines it differently than other people define it. But however it's defined, it's a huge spread. And one of the definitions I found very useful was the one that depended on, instead of on income, on net worth. So that's your debts subtracted from your assets. And in that concept of the middle class, you would be middle class if you had a net worth of 0 all the way up to $500,000. So again, that's a huge spread. But what I'm interested in is, having lived on both ends of that middle class spread in my adult life, I guess I'm interested in how people who are on the upper end of that spread remain focused on their own financial struggles, some of which are imagined struggles. And I think this is becoming abundantly obvious under the pandemic, where there's people like me who are middle class professionals who are doing their work safely from home over Zoom, not getting a lot of exposure out in the world. And while all of our basic needs are being taken care of by essential workers who often don't have the same kinds of security that we have. And this is, I'm talking about a range of security, from housing security to retirement security to healthcare security to the kind of security that you get from having a savings account to send a child to college. And that's not even getting into the kind of security that Imani was talking about, which is about the sense of security that you can walk down the street without losing your life. So that's another insecurity. So I guess what I was interested in watching my own psychology was, I was asking myself, am I getting too preoccupied with the ways in which I'm insecure financially, so much that I'm not actually seeing the reality of my situation?
Mm-hmm. That's great. And actually, a question just popped up for you in the chat. You mentioned acts of defiance of the economic system we live in. Could you give an example?
Yeah, so this is something I've been thinking about a lot, just small little acts of resistance. And I'm really very interested in everyday resistance, in resistance that is folded into a lived life. And I've been reading recently a lot about the French resistance to the Nazi occupation. And there was lots of acts in that resistance that were small, that weren't about armed resistance, that were about putting a sticker on someone's mailbox that let them know that if they wanted to resist too, you were with them. It was about little communications like that. And I think I'm not even sure it's an act of resistance, but it's like the thought experiment that leads you to be able to resist is by resisting the narrative that suggests to us that wherever we are financially, that we don't have enough. So in writing this book, I started thinking, what if I told myself I had plenty? Then what would I be able to do? And actually it opens up many avenues of generosity for other people. And one of the acts I was inspired by was, I was reading about Toni Morrison, and when she was raising 2 children as a single mother, if she got extra money of any sort, she would give it to another woman writer as a grant, she called it. She would make grants to another woman writer. And so I took inspiration from that, and I started making grants to other women writers, finding ways to give small amounts of money to other women writers so that they could do their work. It's small, but I guess that's what I'm interested in, these little tiny things that make a difference in other people's lives.
That's lovely. That's great. So we had a few questions for Imani. People were saying, first of all, somebody asked what the book was so they could buy it immediately, which we encourage. Again, there's a little green button, buy books now, and buy them now if you want them. Get them for Christmas and everything, because it helps the festival, it helps the authors, and it helps independent bookstores. So do that. The book is Breathe. Someone said, Imani, we should all say that could be my child and act accordingly. They found that inspiring. Someone else said, thank you for those optimistic reminders. Hard to find the silver linings these days. And then someone else, this wasn't directed at you as all of us, but I wanted maybe you to take this one. Someone said, I am of the belief about the American dream, as the late George Carlin described, the American dream, you have to be asleep to believe in it. It is a sham and always has been for the masses of people in this country, our audience member says. Do you agree?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated question to answer. I mean, certainly, for African Americans, the American dream has always been a fiction. I do think that we cannot, and that, is really at the foundation of the establishment of the country, right? So if you say in the 19th century, cotton is the single most important crop in the world, and the United States accumulates its wealth in part because, given how labor intensive cotton was, right, growing cotton was, having a completely manipulable workforce, right, is absolutely part of what facilitated the growth, the expansion of the nation. And then you have in the 20th century, the New Deal policies that did create, I mean, there was a massive expansion in the American middle class. It changed the quality of life. So I do think there is, to some extent, an American dream in that, right? And the consequence of the New Deal, but it's also the case that African Americans were systematically excluded from that, right? The building of the suburbs systematically excluded from that. The federal highway program destroying Black neighborhoods all over the country, the impact of white flight on the prospect of integration. I mean, there's layers of it. And so I wouldn't say that there has never been any American dream, but I think there's a lesson to be learned by the history of exclusion and the ease with which we have done it historically, right? And that at the present moment, given how much people across the board are experiencing vulnerability, that retelling the history of this nation as one that has always been sort of profoundly unequal in terms of prosperity is important for us to do the kind of reimagining that both Stephanie and Eula were talking about. I was thinking about, when Eula was reading about the Pokemon game, about watching my younger son when he was small, giving away Pokemon cards and thinking, he doesn't know yet that this is not how you play, right? For him, like he was, he liked people, so he wanted to give them his cards. And I do think that, or, the giving, that the shift in disposition will be facilitated by the way that we tell the history and all of its ugliness, to let go of the mythologies of the nation, certainly. So.
Great. So Stephanie, someone wrote, I read the Wonderful Deficit book and got my millennial kids to read it, and they loved it. Would make a great gift. So there's your advertisement from somebody in the chat. And I'd like to direct this question from Ann Duddy to you. Liberal Democrats are often viewed as cultural elites. In my opinion, it is because they have had access to a better education than many others, and education leads to increased access to wealth. Do you think that our educational system, particularly public education, is keeping people from attaining the American dream?
Well, in some respects, yes. I mean, to the extent that access, we say, we want to have access to affordable education. That's not how I say it. I think everybody should have a right to an education. But the liberal elites, the way that many politicians have talked about education, is to ground it in using language like access and affordability, in the same way that we talk about healthcare, right? So that does mean that increasingly higher education becomes more and more out of reach for more and more people who can't afford to take on the sort of financial commitment, often including lots of debt to get through college. It is true that a higher degree gets you statistically, increases the odds of you ending up financially better off over time. And so, if you're looking to live the American dream, college is a big part of that. But I think it's important to realize that for many, many groups, college is not enough. And there are economists and scholars out there who do work in this area, looking at the racial wealth gap, for example. I'm thinking of people like William Sandy Darity or Derek Hamilton, who write on this. And together they did a report called Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain. And their argument in that paper was essentially that education is not enough to close the racial wealth gap for Blacks in this country, that a white person with a high school degree will end up earning more over the course of their lifetime than Blacks with a couple of years of college with an associate's degree. And so it just becomes that much more difficult for some in society to use education as a stepping stone to the American dream. So in other words, we have to do a lot more than just ensure that everybody can get a good education, because that isn't enough to level the playing field to ensure that the American dream is within reach for all Americans.
That's wonderful. Okay, so we are down to our last 7 minutes. So we have to fix America in 7 minutes, which with this group, I think the three of you could do it if anybody could. So I just want to maybe try to end on an optimistic note for everybody and on a hopeful note. And to say, like, if the American dream that we heard about is little Generation X girls, that, this is going to be upward mobility as far as the eye can see. If that dream is essentially dead right now, what new dreams should we be dreaming? So I wonder if you could each briefly just say what your hope is. Like, what would you like to see happening? Especially I think now that things have gotten to this point where we have to build back differently once things reopen and the world begins to open up again. So what would you each like to see? Any order?
I'll go
Eula.
This is an easy one for me, because the American dream was never really, I never felt like the American dream was ever my dream. I didn't dream of owning a house, though I have one now. My dream for the last 20 years has always been to, and it's what I'm still working on now, to live a sustainable life as an artist. I always wanted to just be able to do the work that I love, and to stay reasonably stable economically while I do the work that I love as an artist. And I think it's a great dream for us to collectively dream of people being able to pursue work that they love and be compensated for it. Like, that would be a wonderful society if we could manage that. And I think we can, actually. I think that we can compensate people for doing work like childcare and mothering that we all agree is important and that goes uncompensated or totally undercompensated, like art making does.
I'll just say that I think a lot about Generation Z and younger ages of our children, and how to kind of encourage and emancipate their imaginations, and to discourage them from thinking solely in terms of practicality and fear, but really actually to embrace dreaming, and that we might be focused on teaching them the value of being in right relation, not just with the people in their midst, but also with the earth in its midst, that becomes sort of the center of our ethics.
Stephanie?
Yeah, well, so, I think we all agree that the pieces have all fallen apart in this economy with coronavirus and the economic fallout. And, you have, I guess, a couple of options. When the pieces all fall apart, you can try to grab them and put them back together the way they were, and say, oh, now we're back to normal, or you can take the opportunity to pick those pieces up and assemble them differently and to build back a more resilient, more inclusive economy that checks some of these vulnerabilities that coronavirus just made so apparent to everyone, whether it's, attaching healthcare to employment. California, Oregon, Washington are on fire. I mean, that chapter that I talked about earlier, the deficits that matter, there is an opportunity here for us now to deal with climate, to deal with so many of the problems, housing and healthcare, education. So, my hope will be that we will see the opportunity, that we will begin to address the deficits that matter, and that we won't allow concerns about money and deficits and debt to get in the way of allowing us to get where we so easily can go right now.
That's wonderful. I think that's maybe a good note to end on. Before we do end, I just want to remind everybody about the books we were discussing. So Stephanie Kelton's is The Deficit Myth. Somebody in the chat, as you saw, said, give it to all your millennials. Having and Being Had by Eula Biss. Where did Breathe go? Oh, sorry, going under my other computer. It's a nice size. It can be hidden, but it's Breathe, A Letter to My Sons. And a lot of people in the chat were very moved by it. Again, these are wonderful, wonderful gifts. Oh, and mine is Why We Can't Sleep. Thanks, Imani. And it's Give It to the Generation X Woman in Your Life. Thanks to the Brooklyn Book Festival for having us and for throwing together this panel. They set us all up, and I thought, oh, what a crazy bunch of books. But I think it was a nice group. So thank you all for joining me on this Sunday evening. I hope you have a great night, and thanks again to everybody who made this happen.
Thank you so much, Ada.